Do you ever get the feeling we might be seeing the end of democracy in America?
President Trump says Republicans should nationalize voting in the U.S.
Laid out a vision to use the military not against overseas enemies, but for threats he sees here at home.
They're hollowing out the expertise of the civil service. They're punishing dissent in every form that it takes. They're sidelining every independent agency. This is straight out of the playbook of dictators and authoritarians all over the world today and through history.
So, yeah. There are a lot of reasons to be worried. In fact, the last video I made set out the case for seeing what's going on at the moment as the start of an American dictatorship, showing how Trump has corrupted the military, established the precedent of soldiers on the street, and turned ICE into a mix of mass surveillance secret police and a pro-regime militia that is ready to enforce his rule. But here's the thing, doing all that research not only showed me the dangers of what Trump is doing, it showed me the weaknesses. So in this video, I want to set out the other side of the argument, why Trump won't be the end of American democracy, facing 3 obstacles that will be difficult to overcome. Now, I realize a lot of people hearing that will just think, what? Won't an argument like this make people complacent? Won't it make a Trump takeover more likely? But here's the thing, so much of Trump's ability to damage democracy so far has come from fear, with everyone from law firms to universities to big tech to Democratic donors all in retreat, cowed by the sense that Trump's power is inevitable. But I think if we all can better see the weaknesses at the heart of Trump's authoritarian project, it wouldn't just help us understand the thing we're trying to fight, it would help us defeat it. Recently, TechCrunch reported on how Homeland Security is trying to force tech companies to hand over information on anti-ICE social media accounts. As I've been exploring on this channel, this is just another example of the US government becoming more and more authoritarian. But it's also a reason today's sponsor is worth knowing about. Most ordinary email accounts like Gmail do not have true end-to-end encryption, and they are able to scan your messages. And that means if you have a government that doesn't obey the law, or companies that are compliant with that government, you could end up in a situation where the government is scanning your emails. With Proton Mail, your emails are encrypted so that only you can read them. Plus, it blocks those invisible email trackers which are so common, there are no ads, and the company is based in Switzerland with its strong privacy laws. On top of all that, Proton lets you create email aliases so you can protect your real inbox from spam, and it automatically sorts your emails and lets you unsubscribe from newsletters in one click, so your inbox stays clean without the effort. Another great thing is that Proton Mail makes it easy for you to import your old emails and switch over gradually. Also, all of that is available on the free plan, with even more features if you want to pay for them. It's honestly a great alternative, so check it out at proton.me/Brendan Miller. The basic problem for an American dictator is that the whole system was designed to be anti-king.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
As every American schoolchild learns, in 1776, the evil English King George III was oppressing his subjects with taxes, blockades, and arrests. The result of that was that the whole vibe of the American Revolution was anti-king. Statues of George III were pulled down, crowds ripped down royal coats of arms from buildings, and the newly established King's College in New York changed its name to Columbia University. This anti-king feeling was so strong that the first constitution of the US didn't have an independent president at all, something the founders ended up fixing when they wrote the constitution that's still used today. But nevertheless, unlike a country with a king, or dictator, where power is overwhelmingly concentrated in one place, in the American system it's divided and spread around. So many powers, such as that over taxation, belong to Congress. Other powers, like those over police and education, are given to the states. That's federalism in other words. While a Bill of Rights limits the power that any part of the government, president, Congress or state, has over the people. And this whole system of limited and divided power is enforced through institutions of law. A written constitution that is hard to change, and a Supreme Court full of judges appointed for life that can't be bossed around. The point is that this system, the way it was designed, matters for how easy it is for a dictator to take over. For example, in Germany, Hitler's rise to dictatorship was made easier because the constitution gave him very strong emergency powers, letting him lock up thousands of political opponents, shut newspapers, all pretty much legally. But in the US system, the president has no equivalent emergency power that lets him suspend the constitution. Or consider the system in the UK. Here, a prime minister with a simple majority in parliament can pretty much pass any law they like. The idea is known as parliamentary sovereignty, and it basically means courts cannot overrule its legislation. A British prime minister can pass a law to put someone in jail without trial, can ban political meetings, he can shut down the free press. There are no limits on what laws Parliament can pass. In fact, it was laws like those that Americans were reacting to when they wrote their constitution that limited government powers. Yeah, parliamentary sovereignty sounds like one of those ideas that has this noble name, but It's actually mad. And when we have a wannabe dictator in the UK, things could get bad pretty quickly. Okay, so the system in America divides and spreads power around rather than concentrating it in the executive, in the leader, which of course is something Trump hates and wants to change. Since becoming president, he's tried to take over Congress's taxing power, imposing tariffs by executive order. He's grabbed control of states' national guards against the wishes of governors. He's announced the firing of a Federal Reserve governor when the Fed is meant to be independent of political control, and ordered the deportation of people living in the US without due process. These are all actions, and there are many more, that effectively take power from Congress, the states, other parts of the executive, and from individuals. This was all in the months and the first year after Trump came to power, and it was scary. Congress, rather than standing up for its powers, was led by Republicans who mostly just let its powers be taken. And I think many were pessimistic about the Supreme Court as well. After all, it has a conservative majority with 3 of the justices appointed by Trump, and a Chief Justice who is known to be a fan of the unitary executive theory, the idea that the president should have complete control over the executive branch. For critics of the court, it wasn't surprising when, in July 2024, the Supreme Court ruled presidents have widespread immunity, killing efforts to prosecute Trump for trying to overturn the 2020 election. And then, in his first year of power, the Supreme Court handed Trump a whole string of victories, allowing him to gut agencies like the Department for Education, and letting ICE agents take factors like speaking Spanish into account when choosing who to stop. At the same time, Trump was attacking the rule of law, trying to redefine, on the basis of him just saying so, a right like birthright citizenship, attacking law firms that have challenged him in the past, while his yes men told government lawyers to go ahead with deportations even if the court told them not to. In other words, it didn't seem like the law was going to hold Trump back and protect American democracy. It was all very depressing. But then things started to change.
The Supreme Court has dealt a significant blow to the Trump administration, blocking the president from deploying the National Guard to Chicago.
Struck down most of President Trump's global tariffs today in a 6-3 decision that is a major blow to his economic agenda.
Since the end of last year, the Supreme Court has ruled against Trump on whether he's allowed to deploy the National Guard. They've halted his tariffs, stopped his administration from deporting people without due process, and is widely predicted to block his efforts to redefine birthright citizenship. Other parts of the rule of law have stood up too. A huge range of people, from Democratic politicians targeted by Trump to the guy who threw a ham sandwich at ICE officers, have been protected by juries who've either refused to indict or convict those they feel are being unfairly targeted. In fact, one of the key targets of Trump's revenge campaign, the ex-FBI director who Trump hates, recently said this.
It might surprise you, especially given my personal experience, but I think the rule of law, so far, has passed a severe stress test.
Yes, this guy who has been repeatedly unfairly targeted by Trump is saying that the courts are actually quite strong.
Judges and juries and grand juries are operating, by and large, as they're supposed to, as a check on executive branch abuses.
Now, the court is still conservative. It recently gutted the Voting Rights Act again and looks set to weaken the whole idea of independent executive agencies created by Congress. But while I don't like this, I think it's a mistake to conclude that the court will just do Trump's bidding. And someone who agrees with that analysis is Donald Trump.
Justice Roberts doesn't like when I say it, but the judges are really hurting this country. And frankly, the justices, the Supreme Court, has really hurt our country too.
Trump has repeatedly badmouthed the courts. His allies in Congress have threatened to impeach those they don't like, and Trump even turned up at the Supreme Court when it was hearing oral arguments on the tariffs case in what seemed like an attempt to intimidate it. But none of this has stopped the courts being independent, and that has hindered Trump's attempts to grab power and suggests the courts won't greenlight Trump evading the constitutional rule against running to be president again in 2028, which, if Trump wants to stay on in power forever and ever, is a problem. This system I've been describing of limited and divided power was strongly influenced by liberalism, a political philosophy that traditionally emphasizes freedom, the rule of law, and individual rights, ideas that were influential at the time the Constitution was written. The way it works in my head, and this isn't an uncommon view, is that liberalism works well in combination with democracy, the idea of majority rule, and you mix these two together to get the system of liberal democracy, majority rule balanced with counter-majority protections against that power. Liberalism is built into the whole American system, but it's the courts that perhaps most embody it, there to enforce rules against politicians who've won power with majority support and who now want to use or abuse that power. Okay, so the courts are the first line of defense against dictatorship and Donald Trump's power grabs, though, as we'll see later, there are methods available to Trump that might allow him to destroy them. Okay, so the next line of defense is that other part of the mix we were just talking about, democracy. Because even if Trump can get around the liberal part of the American system, Trump has to deal with the fact he can't, unlike other leaders he admires, just ignore elections, and his support has fallen to an all-time low. When dictators have won power in other countries, they've often done it off the back of high popular support. Bukele in El Salvador, the self-styled world's coolest dictator, exploited frustration with gang crime to get a huge majority in parliament in 2021, while Viktor Orban in Hungary was able to exploit anger about the financial crisis and the existing parties to win a supermajority in 2010. Certainly if Trump had massive popular support at the moment, many of the liberal defences we talked about in the last chapter would just crumble. He could get Congress to pass a law explicitly delegating him powers over tariffs and other areas, rather than attempting to use a loophole in an existing law and being overruled by the Supreme Court. Or he could just impeach Supreme Court justices that stood in his way and replace them with loyalists.
You got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached.
The first consequence of Trump's low political support is losing the midterms. But the bigger danger for his dictatorship project is the election in 2028. Because even if Trump can get around the constitutional two-term limit, he's still got to win the next presidential election if he wants to carry on in power. Now, of course, you might think, if he's going to be a dictator, won't he just abolish elections? Past dictators like Hitler did exactly this, and were openly contemptuous of democracy as an idea, arguing it sins against the basic aristocratic principle of nature. And today there are regimes like China, or monarchies like Saudi Arabia, that have no meaningful elections and don't even pretend to. But as I explained in my last video, today it's more common for countries to exist in a kind of grey zone between dictatorship and democracy, where elections remain in place but are undermined. Sometimes the elections are undermined in a very obvious way. Dictators like Saddam Hussein, for example, getting 100% of the vote, while in 2013, Azerbaijan's election commission accidentally published the results of the election a day before voting even began. But often things are more subtle. So for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary kept elections in place, but engaged in extensive gerrymandering, cracked down on private political donors, and had 80% of the country's media under his control. Another example is Putin in Russia, who also has elections, but has repeatedly cracked down on protesters and targeted opposition parties and candidates with disqualification, arrest, and murder. It seems like today's dictators believe, and sadly I think they're right, that the liberal part of the system has less popular support than the democracy part, especially as it's often elite types, journalists, opposition politicians, academics, who feel it first when liberal rights like freedom of speech get taken away. And yet while liberalism has weaker prestige, the idea of democracy remains strong. And so dictators, unlike in the past, are more cautious about just abolishing elections. For example, it always struck me how Donald Trump, after losing the election, didn't say elections should be abolished, they make us weak and so on. He just said, no, the election's been stolen. Now, as someone who's interested in the history of ideas, this change, this prestige that democracy has, which is different from 1930s fascism and so on, it's interesting. But it also has a real life consequence because it means that today's dictators have a vulnerability. Just recently, for example, we saw Viktor Orban of Hungary lose elections, even after all his efforts to tilt things in his favour. Something similar happened in Poland in 2023, and something similar could happen in other grey zone dictatorships like India or Turkey. Okay, so leaders of today's grey zone dictatorships can't abolish elections, they can just undermine them. Which is, of course, what Donald Trump is trying to do. Trump has pushed voter ID laws he believes will boost support for his side, attacked mail-in voting, encouraged the manipulation of election maps in numerous states, attacked funding platforms like ActBlue that are often used by Democrats, and in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk, announced he would be targeting non-profits and their funders with IRS and FBI investigations.
Believe it. These are anarchists and agitators, professional anarchists and agitators, and they get hired by wealthy people.
Trump has also threatened opposition politicians, had his business allies start to neuter media outlets, and threatened to use government power against TV channels. However, despite all these actions, competitive and consequential elections remain on the horizon. Trump's efforts in this area are hampered by federalism, another liberal anti-tyrant technology used by the founders, with the Constitution vesting the power to set the times, places and manner of elections with states. While in many countries, Russia for example, elections are organised by the central government, meaning there's a single point of failure. In the US, stealing a national election requires compromising thousands of independent election offices across dozens of jurisdictions. Another big issue for Trump is that he faces a united and quite strong opposition. Compare 1930s Germany, for example, where Hitler was helped by the fact that communists and social democrats hated each other. Or consider Orban in Hungary, who often faced a divided opposition, and who was only finally defeated when the opposition consolidated behind one candidate. It might seem odd to say because every critic of Trump has their own problems with the Democratic Party, but relatively speaking, they are actually a healthy opposition. Okay, so another obstacle for Trump is the fact elections still exist in America. But say he lost, wouldn't he just repeat what he did last time and try and overturn the result?
I just want to find 11,780 votes.
Well, if he does, Trump will face the third and final obstacle to becoming an American dictator.
On October 9th, 1989, an unprecedented 70,000 people gathered in the city to demand their freedom.
In East Germany in 1989, a series of protests helped bring an end to 40 years of communist authoritarian rule. And there are many other examples of protests bringing down authoritarian systems. There's the toppling of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in 2000, and just last year protests helped lead to the end of regimes in Nepal and Bangladesh. If Trump tries to overturn an election, like he did on January 6th, or grab power in some other way, there would be protests. And these protests would be a problem. I realise this might sound romantic or naive to think that people power can overturn fascism and so on. But as we've seen, protests can turn into a dictator's nightmare. Academic Erica Chenoweth posits the 3.5% rule, the idea that few regimes have survived protest movements that involved 3.5% of the population. Now, this is more of an observation than a rule, and there are exceptions, but this idea does highlight the role protests have played in the toppling of many authoritarian regimes. 3.5% of the US population is about 12 million people, and the No King's Day protests numbered 7 million, and that's in an America where the outlet of actual elections still exists. Consider also the impact of protests in 2020, or the way resistance in Minneapolis in early 2026 caused a retreat there. Another factor many people mention at this point is how many guns the US population has. But while I appreciate the spirit of this point, I actually think it's wrong-headed. Part of Chenoweth's argument is that non-violent protests are more effective than violent ones because they have much wider participation, make it harder for the regime to demonize the protesters or to justify violence against them. Regardless, the point of all this is that ordinary people quite like democracy, and I wouldn't expect them to be happy about it being taken away from them. I think this is true in all countries, but I think it's especially true in a country like America that has such a long history and culture of democracy. Now, of course, there are many ways in which American history hasn't been democratic and liberal, but the fact remains that America has had meaningful elections for at least 220 years, and there's a culture, a set of myths and beliefs about democracy that is a problem for someone trying to end American democracy. Consider that for years we've heard that imposing democracy on countries abroad is foolish. But by that logic, why would Americans accept someone imposing autocracy on them? So we've seen these three obstacles in Trump's way. First, the courts and the liberal system of law. Second, elections and democracy. And then, if all else fails, raw people power. So that's the story so far, but what might Trump do next? Well, starting with the courts, there are things Trump could do, but here I think it's useful to discuss three impediments Trump faces. The first of these is a lack of competence.
In a vote opposed by the US, EU and human rights groups, the Hungarian parliament on Monday adopted legislation that critics say will shackle the Constitutional Court.
If Trump wanted to be dictator, the courts and judges should have been his first target. A good comparison is Viktor Orban in Hungary, who made the courts his first target after winning power in 2010. He passed a new retirement law, meaning lots of old judges had to leave their jobs, giving him the chance to handpick replacements, and he packed the court, meaning he expanded its size, giving him the opportunity to add new members who would be loyal to him. The result was that after 2013, the judges never contradicted Orban's government in any politically important case. This option was open to Trump. The size of the Supreme Court is not set by the Constitution and has varied over time, and all he needed was a majority in both houses, which he had. It probably would have been a tough fight. Roosevelt had massive majorities in 1937 and still wouldn't do it. But if Trump had focused his efforts at the time of his highest popularity, he might have done it. Then, with his yes men in the court, he could get any ruling he liked. No more two-term restriction, imprison whoever you like, effectively do whatever you want. But Trump never went for it. Instead, he used his political capital on pointless revenge attacks. Okay, so if he didn't do it then, could he do it now? Well, here's the second handicap: lack of time. If you look at other dictatorships, it often takes those leaders years to consolidate power. Erdogan in Turkey, for example, became leader in 2003, but it wasn't until 13 years later, when an attempted coup presented him with an opportunity, that he really consolidated power. Doing things slowly is just easier. The opposition loses the unifying power of urgency, judges just retire and you can replace them with your people, and the public just gets used to the new status quo. Trump, however, has just 2 years to neuter the courts before the 22nd Amendment stops him running again. When I started researching into this area, I always thought of protests as the way that dictators fall. But as Yale political scientist Milan Svolik argues, every authoritarian leader faces two problems. Along with the problem of authoritarian control, that's the threat of protests, they have the problem of what he calls authoritarian power sharing, the need to keep other elites within the regime happy. In other words, if you're a dictator, you don't just face threat from below, you face a threat from the side. In fact, in one study, since 1950, about 65% of dictators have been removed by regime insiders, other elites. Similarly, Trump's power rests a huge amount on elites like this. Not only the conservative Supreme Court justices who have, as we've seen, failed to do everything he wants, but there are the Republicans in Congress who currently dare not criticize him even when his unpopular actions could lose them their jobs. And it's important to understand that for these elites, a lot of their loyalty comes down to future expectations. When a politician's power is expected to grow, then elites tend to bandwagon, getting behind that person regardless of their personal feelings because they hope to benefit from being a supporter. On the other hand, if a politician's power is expected to decline, then these elites are more likely to defect or jump ship. After all, why stay loyal? This person's on the way out. We could call this the momentum theory of power, and it's a dynamic you see widely in politics. In primary contests, for example, commentators ask who's got the momentum, while presidents in their final term become lame ducks. When Trump's power was on the rise, many bent the knee, from business leaders, top law firms, universities to rivals, even when what he was doing was against their interests. But Trump's limited time to the next election, and just the fact he's really old, is fatal to this dynamic. Elites, whether they're judges or congressmen, will see less and less benefit in bending the knee for a dictatorship project that is time limited. So that's two impediments, but there are still options available to Trump. When Fujimori was dictator of Peru, his intelligence advisor was very adept at hijacking judges, as well as many other political actors. One method was to videotape them taking bribes or entering brothels, and then blackmailing them. He also used straightforward bribery, just delivering cash to people's homes. So why doesn't Trump do that? Another mystery is why Trump doesn't attack judges more. I mean, they're already getting threats, but Trump could go further. And he could also remove the protection of US Marshals. Another powerful weapon Trump could use is the presidential pardon. He's already corruptly used the pardon power to reward supporters, but the bigger danger is what have been called henchman pardons, where he might, for example, tell the FBI to hack a judge's computer so he can get material to blackmail them with, or tell ICE to just kidnap them. You could even have, in theory, a supporter killing a judge, and if it happened on federal property like a courthouse where states don't have any jurisdiction, he could just let them off and they'd get away with it. In fact, all crimes that happen in Washington, D.C. are prosecuted by the US Attorney for D.C., a presidential appointee. So why hasn't Trump taken these extreme steps? Well, there are many reasons, but one of them, I think, is that he isn't hell-bent on trying to become a dictator. Now, as I argued in my last video, Trump is hurting democracy. He is degrading it, but he's doing it in this ad hoc, instinctive manner rather than a master plan. Now, he should still be held accountable for the damage he's doing, and I do think he's capable of anything. He has already tried to overturn an election, but compared to someone like Putin, he isn't driven by this all-consuming desire for dictatorship. And this weak desire matters for the final outcome. It ends up being another reason that an American dictatorship is less likely to happen. Okay, so what about the next obstacle that Trump faces? Elections and Trump's lack of mass political support. Again, I think incompetence is going to matter here. For example, Trump's voter ID laws and his attacks on mail-in voting could end up backfiring. Meanwhile, his attacks on opponents have failed to remove them from the political arena and have just boosted their prestige and have generally boosted democratic turnout in elections. Also, look at the economy. Tariffs, the Iran war, all that has helped crater his political support. The economist Paul Krugman makes the argument that autocrats like Hitler often consolidate their power with strong economic growth. But Trump's incompetence on this issue means that's not happening. I also think Trump was foolish to focus on the media. When Orban attacked the media in Hungary, he had the benefit of there being little Hungarian language media outside the country. But American politics is covered by lots of international outlets, as well as the odd British YouTuber, that are outside of Trump's control. In terms of what Trump could do next, the obvious plays from the dictator's playbook would be some kind of war or emergency. For example, in 1999, Putin, then a little-known prime minister, launched a war in Chechnya in response to a string of terrorist bombings that many claimed were organized by his own security services. His opinion poll ratings surged, he won the presidency, and then used wartime conditions to take over independent television and increase his powers. A war, an assassination attempt, a terrorist attack, any of these scenarios would help Trump consolidate power. But again, I think weak desire is a factor here. I mean, think about the war with Iran. That could have been the pretext for a dictatorship push. We could have had a long media campaign building up the enemy that unifies people in America against them. We could have been having a witch hunt for traitors in the deep state, but we just haven't seen anything like that. Consider that when the Reichstag was burnt down, Adolf Hitler used the event as an opportunity to imprison opponents and shut down opposition newspapers. But when a guy tries to assassinate Trump at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, Trump uses this as an excuse to push for his new ballroom. Now, of course, we still don't know what's going to happen in the upcoming elections. The last time he lost an election, he tried to overturn it. And at the moment, we're seeing lots of gerrymandering. He's talked about nationalising elections. Allies have suggested using ICE or declaring an emergency to take over the elections. But again, I think the issue of limited time and elite defection could hinder Trump. Remember, January the 6th failed because of elites. The courts rejected more than 60 lawsuits, while Republicans refused to find votes he needed and didn't support him in Congress. And in the aftermath, Trump had to eat humble pie.
The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy.
If I were Trump, I just wouldn't be super confident that the courts or other Republicans are definitely going to support me if I try and overturn an election. When it comes to our last obstacle of people power and protests, the normal dictator answer is to send in the security forces. So here's the question: would US security forces help install Trump as dictator? In my previous video, I set out how Trump has worked to corrupt those forces, recruiting ideological supporters as ICE officers and undermining neutrality in the military with political-style rallies. What's more, polling indicates the military leans Republican. And actually, in 2021, 124 retired generals and admirals signed a letter supporting Trump's doubts about the 2020 election. Also, Trump might not need the whole military to support him. Military coups have often succeeded with a small number of soldiers, sowing confusion and working quickly. And similarly, to put down protests, he might only need 1 or 2 units to carry out the actions while others stood by. However, it is worth remembering that these won't be normal run-of-the-mill protests, and repression could actually make them grow. For example, in Ukraine, during another set of protests, this time over the president's last-minute rejection of EU integration, the president sent in riot police. But the violence provoked even more protests, and within months the president had to flee the country. In his book, How Tyrants Fall, Dr. Marcel Dursus called this dynamic of protests leading to repression and thus to more protests and so on, you shoot, you lose. To defeat this dynamic, you need to go big, as the Chinese did in Tiananmen Square in 1979, killing thousands, or as happened more recently in Iran, where even more protesters were killed. But even if Trump has the stomach to order so many killings, it won't necessarily be easy to get the military to go along with it. Getting soldiers to boo Joe Biden is one thing, getting them to kill Americans is a harder task. Remember those protests in East Germany in 1989? Well, the regime actually had troops ready for a crackdown, and they'd even told local hospitals to prepare for mass casualties. But on the day, local commanders hesitated, and the order to fire never came. After that, the protests only grew, and within a month, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Also, military commanders, like other elites, are making a calculation based on whether they think such a takeover will succeed. Think about it. Would you join a coup to support a guy who's 79 years old and who has clear health problems, wildly unpopular, someone who's repeatedly called US soldiers like you suckers and losers? And this is a coup probably led by someone like Pete Hegseth, who can't even organise a top secret group chat without accidentally inviting a journalist. All this in a country with no history of coups or dictatorships succeeding, and knowing you would face serious repercussions if it all falls apart. It's kind of a big ask. Also, what about the police? Thanks again to federalism, there are over 700,000 police officers in the US who do not follow presidential orders and who are often quite well armed. The fact that Trump hasn't done anything about this, hasn't even thought about it most likely, is just one of the many ways in which his corruption of the security forces is not complete. For example, while Trump did last year announce the creation of a quick reaction force for, quote, quelling civil disturbances, and he does have growing numbers of ICE officers, these are nothing like the dedicated forces dictators like Putin have created. And that's not all that's missing. Dictators usually build a parallel military, a separate armed force that will protect them from army coups, something like Hitler's SS, for example. Trump also doesn't really have a proper secret police focused on political opposition. Trump is also not counterbalancing, which is when a dictator sets up parts of the security forces against each other. We're not really seeing brutalization, which is when you get them to do awful things that then bind them to you. I mean, I could go on. My point is that a coercive regime is a serious project, And I just don't really think we're seeing it. Coups aren't easy. Look at the failure of the president of South Korea in 2024, who tried to declare martial law and who's now in prison. Or the failure of Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2023. Someone trying to build a dictatorship in America has their work cut out for them. And Trump's lack of competence, time, and weak desire are all working against him being able to do it. Okay, so I made a video setting out the pessimistic case, and now we've had the more optimistic case. And if you can't tell already, I am more convinced by this more optimistic case. I don't think Trump has got the ability to build a full-on consolidated American dictatorship. Of course, he has done significant damage, and long-term, I'm much more worried. There is a general low regard for the ideas of liberalism on parts of the left, yes, but definitely on the right. And considering that even if Trump is on the way out, a different Republican will be in power before long, and I worry about how a more focused person than Trump might take things. But also, there's a case that being optimistic might actually help defeat Trump. Remember, many elites are supporting him because they expect his power to grow and are more likely to defect if they can see how limited his power is. So, while we should never be complacent, I think there's value in pointing out not just the dangers of Trump's authoritarianism, but its weaknesses as well. Hi, in case you're interested, I also make bonus videos. I talk about recent news, things to read, respond to questions, whatever seems interesting. They're released first to supporters, either here on YouTube or you can go to Substack where there are other goodies as well. While I'm here, I'd also like to recommend this book by Marcel Dursus and also to recommend his YouTube channel, @Dr. Marcel Dursus. Thanks to him and thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.